In the 1960s, there were places in Fort Wayne where if you were African American, you were not welcome. This was also the case in the decades that preceded the 60s. However, during this decade of change, protests began to see slow progress in equal housing, employment, and education.
I remember as a young lady when I was in high school, I would go down, there was only one of those stores that would serve blacks, and that was a Kresge's. And we had about 3 or 4 seats that we could sit in. And I worked at Fishman's in the beauty salon. And I would walk down to that store because it was the only place that you could sit down. And then you couldn't even sit down in Murphy's. You had to stand up at a counter and be served. So I would go to Kresge's and sit down, and I will never forget, I always ordered a cheese sandwich, a grilled cheese sandwich, cherry pie, and a cherry Coke. And that was the only 10-cent store. It was a 10-cent store that would accept blacks and let them sit in those 3 or 4 seats.
And in Murphy's, they had this counter in the front where anybody could go.
Stand up.
And stand up, but in the back was a lovely bar area, but you couldn't go there.
You didn't know until you sat down at the counter, and then they all stand up. You waiting for a waitress to come wait on you, and you sit there waiting and waiting and waiting. So you say, "Hey, come over here," and she said, "I can't." You said, "What's wrong?" "I can't wait on colored folk. Can't wait on black people." Well, you didn't know it till you sit down. Embarrassment. That happened. So we had to protest against restaurants.
The English Tea Room was a very popular restaurant downtown, and we could not eat there. No signs, but if you went in for service, they would say, "I'm sorry, we cannot serve you," or "We have no seats available, we have reservations." They would just make up excuses so that we could not eat there. So many years later, a group of black guys did go together, and they actually bought that English Terrace Tea Room. And they kept it for a very short time. But nevertheless, I was very proud of that. But there was not one place that we could eat. Even Coney Island, the hot dog places down on Main Street, we would go in and buy our hot dogs and take them out, but we could not even sit there and eat. It was more or less taken for granted, no signs, but it was a spoken code that we could not eat. In any of these places, not any of them could we eat. We were not welcome.
Public housing in Fort Wayne, when I came to Fort Wayne, was segregated. I'm talking about totally subsidized federal public housing in a part of town called Westville, where you had people who were living in public housing who were African Americans on one side of the street, and people who lived in public housing who were white living on the other side of the street. And that didn't change until after 1968.
As far as the police department, when I first came here, I think they had about 6, if that many, minority on the police force. That's all. And the story was they couldn't find any qualified. So we created a protest. We had this march in the street by the hundreds. So now they have any number of minorities on there, Mexicans, blacks, and etc. on there now. They had no female. Fire department was no minority at all. No. So we had to create a protest.
When I first took office, this was in early 1960, the Urban League and other black groups prevailed upon me to put the first black fireman on the force. We had never had a black up until that time. And I put the fellow in the Fire Prevention Bureau. And that, of course, did not set well with the firemen because they still did not want a black on the force, and they knew that the door was open and more would follow. And after I did put this fellow on the force, many of the blacks were dissatisfied because they didn't think that was a true place for a fireman. That was only tokenism. They wanted to see him on a fire truck. And politically, it was a part of my demise. I'll put it that way, to be very honest about it. But I knew that the day would come when you just could not continue to keep black people off the fire department. And some of these firemen worked like Trojans to put me in office. Some of them I went to high school with. And it was just not very compatible with staying in office as far as the firemen are concerned.
in the early 60s. And we were trick-or-treating, and we decided to go over in the Old Mill area, my daughter and her friend. And they went over in the Old Mill area, and people were so very nice to them. They gave them all kinds of treats and everything, just real nice. And then we went to a house on the corner of the Old Mill Road and pet it. And the kids knocked on the door, and I was, back in the shadows. So when my daughter held out her little brown hand for her treat, the lady looked at it and she said, "You don't live in this neighborhood." She said, "You go to your own neighborhood and get treats." And that just ruined the whole evening. Everybody had been so nice, but that one incident of rejection has stuck in my daughter's mind for eternity.
All of these things was going on in Fort Wayne, and we just felt like that something should be done. So we moved out to do something, and there were some changes made.
At that time, many communities were searching for a particular personality to head up their Urban League affiliates. You probably would not recall, but in 1967 and 1968, there was quite a bit of civil turmoil. And I remember that one of the staff members, Jacqueline Patterson, and William Watson, who worked at the Lincoln, attended a conference in New York City and knew that I had some Hoosier roots, having lived in Indianapolis, and interested me in coming to Fort Wayne at that time, because I guess you might say that I was militant enough to persuade or dissuade those people who were purportedly militants, and then I was intelligent enough to be able to communicate the issues to those people who could do something about those issues. So I was kind of an in-between person.
There were a lot of protest movements and marches in Fort Wayne in the 1960s.
That's right.
A lot of them.
Like the one for a school board member. When did that take place? I know we marched in that. Families marched. My older children, who are now in their early 40s, 41, were little children, and we took them with us as we marched. The whole family marched under the leadership of Reverend John Dixie, and Reverend Jesse White really spearheaded. But we met at the John Dixie church, Pilgrim Baptist Church, and we'd march all the way downtown and stop at the City Hall in order to protest the fact that we had, and the fact that we did want a black representative on the school board.
It was some scary times, and because people were setting fires and damaging police cars and writing nasty letters and anonymous complaints, and people were afraid that something was going to happen. Well, nothing major really happened, and that's because the Urban League was able to put together the kind of a team that could meet with people and address their issues and let those people know what had to be done in order to make Fort Wayne a more livable city, not to coin that phrase, but that's exactly what happened.
Some of the clergy, Reverend White, I knew him real well, they did a lot to control the violence, to simmer it down from what it could have become. It was just the community working together to control a few individuals or some groups and try to explain to them, hey, if you want this, you have to do this, this, and this, and it will come.
We were pretty naive back then. I was at Northside High School, and it was an all-white high school, basically, till my senior year, and then only one black student, and that was even considered, how's the school going to handle this? You look back and you think, how did we not realize that something's happening here, that there is unofficial segregation, if not official segregation. One of my friends from grade school was African American. I remember I'd take him. My grandfather was a member of the Fort Wayne Country Club, and I remember inviting him out to go swimming with me one time in the 60s. And I didn't think anything of it. He'd been my friend since grade school, but sort of afterwards, you hear people talking about, what's this kid doing, bringing somebody that's black to the swimming pool. You didn't realize what was going on in the world necessarily. When you were young, you were accepting and you had friends at different schools in different parts of town, and you thought that that was the right way to do things. It's kind of like going to hear King speak in 1963. One of my good friends, Pete Meister, his dad was the chief minister at First Presbyterian Church. They were part of the group of ministers that brought in Dr. King, so I got a chance to sit on the platform at Scottish Rite and hear Dr. King speak and shake his hand, Ralph Abernathy before him. But at the same time this was going on, and I didn't realize that my father was prosecuting attorney, they were concerned that there might be riots in town or some racial problems, Klan types or others protesting it. And so while I'm inside listening to the speech, unbeknownst to me, my father's with a group outside checking to make sure that there's not any civil violence going on. And it was something I felt accepting and wanted to meet people, but society was going through a tough time there.
Because of the involvement of the Urban League in creating an atmosphere of open housing and equal employment opportunities, and our involvement in trying to achieve racial balance in the schools, on several occasions, we, the Urban League, were invited to step outside of the United Way family because people began to withdraw their pledges to the United Way because the Urban League was involved. As a matter of fact, of course, a lot of these people have died now, but some prominent citizens asked the Urban League to voluntarily withdraw, and which we didn't do.
They shot in my window at the house. Bullet went in the window and everything, busted the window. I was called some everything, radical. And I was just threatened, they burned a cross over my lawn at the house. I had to have bodyguards around a lot of time. I had to have people around the house just for safety's sake.
How frightening.
And the church, they broke into the church house a lot of time and got in my seat, just stood up in the chair. They just let me know I can get you if I want to, But I never give up on that.
We gained a lot of influence because we were involved in the boycott of the Fort Wayne Community Schools in order to get them desegregated, and it took a while. In fact, it took much too long and spent too many dollars, but it was done, and the Urban League, along with the Ministerial Alliance, and NAACP, we were all involved in the desegregation of the schools.
It was so encouraging, because, just to see how the community was coming together because we was protesting. And we was convinced that if you said nothing about anything, well, wouldn't anything be done?
As the 1960s began, few of us had heard of Martin Luther King. And by the early to mid-60s, Martin Luther King was a household word because of all the things he was doing in the South, and for that matter, all over the country. And his impact was definitely felt in Fort Wayne probably in the early 1960s, and it gathered momentum through the mid-60s, and of course tragically ended with his assassination in 1968.
I think the King assassination, though, hit everyone. I mean, I don't recall that. That was a non-polarizing civil rights event. I think everybody universally. Here's a guy, the big mystery was, why would you choose to assassinate a non-violent black leader when there were many more militant? The Black Panther Party had people that were calling for open rebellion, and King was trying to pull things together. Well, the simple answer is he was making it work. It was happening, and that was,
I had my daughter at that time. She'd been born in 1956, so she was about 7 years old when Dr. King was killed. So what we did was we were glued to the television, and she watched everything. I said, I want you to see what they have done to us. And I made sure that everything that happened, we were glued to the television, and I explained to her we ate in front of the television set. We slept in front of the television set. And we watched everything that happened that they had on television in those times. And a lot of times we sat before these things and tears just automatically flew, just dropped. She looked at her mom and dad and she cried also. So she remembers very vividly in her mind all of these things that happened. She remembers Bull Connor and the police dogs and the water hose.
Oh, yes.
All of these things are deeply embedded in her mind.
We had some marches here that I recall in the mid-1960s, and then, of course, when the tragic event happened in, I believe, April of 1968, the city, as were all cities, was braced for some type of reaction, perhaps violence.
As far as the police department was concerned, we had demonstrations. We used to say in Fort Wayne that if New York sneezed today, in 2 months we caught cold in Fort Wayne. But yeah, we had some demonstrations and some marches and burnings on Pontiac Street and Maumee Avenue. And I was out looking at your towers out here. I remember the night they cut the wires of a tower down on Gay Street, a huge radio tower, and it went down.
Boy, when the news flashed that he was assassinated, then that just tore the hearts out of people. We just felt like our Moses was dead, you know. It was just done now. So that's why they got in the streets, started burning. They just lost their intelligence. They started burning down houses.
There were elements in the community that successfully, I'm ashamed to tell you, were able to keep certain events from being publicized, if you will, to the degree that they probably should have. Yeah, there was trouble the night King was killed, but it was downplayed. It was downplayed by the media because we were asked by city administration and specifically law enforcement not to exacerbate problems, not to, you know, listen, I mean, don't call it a riot, call it a disturbance. It would be best if you didn't report. I mean, window breaking is probably something that we should avoid reporting because we don't want to cause more trouble. And it was fairly subtle, but we got the message pretty clearly that we were being looked upon, we in media, as a way to sort of keep the lid on, if you will. And I'll be darned if we didn't do it. And I'm not sure that we were right to. I'm not sure we were wrong to, but I'm not sure that we were right to either. I mean, you know, I think our responsibility is to reflect what's happening, and you can make a judgment and determination on whether it's significant or insignificant. To some degree, I think we probably do have a responsibility not to make something greater than it is and thereby cause more trouble by doing so. That was certainly the message that was sent to us, and most of us, I must admit, went along with that.
You really felt things spiraling out of control. Democratic convention in Chicago later on. It was a crazy world.
I look back on 1968 as a classic example. How the heck we survived that year, I don't know. I mean, if you really think about the things that occurred in that 1 year, you've got the Tet Offensive, which was the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong complete attack on the entire nation of South Vietnam. I mean, nobody was safe. The embassy was being attacked. Saigon was being attacked. I mean, all of the places that GIs there thought they were safe in were suddenly under fire. It brought the war home to the American public. It caused huge numbers of demonstrations, not the least of which were the Chicago Convention riots. You know, being a news guy, getting up in the morning and walking into work and finding out what that night's inactivity brought was stunning. I mean, it was just, there was one major event after, and the assassinations. I mean, you know, my goodness, just those two alone, the Kennedy assassination and the Dr. King assassination. Those were, I mean, it was really an amazing year to have survived that. It's just, you know, amazing that this country stayed together as well as it did.